Moving on to another set of questions. Relating to your dissents, I think you can learn a lot about a judge by looking at his or her dissents. And that's why judges go out of their way to voice their disagreement with the majority and show what their views are. And you have the highest dissent rate among active D.C. Circuit judges, 5.1 dissents per year. I'm going to talk about several studies that analyze your decision. The first study by Professor Elliot Nash and Professor Daniel Chen shows that compared to other circuit court judges elevated to the Supreme Court since the 1980s, you not only had the highest rate of dissents, you also had the highest rate of partisan dissents. So I think I have a chart on that. Well, maybe not. Suffice to say, there is such a study, and I ask unanimous consent to have the study by Professors Ash and Chen be entered into the record. The second study by people, thank you. I'm on a roll here, Mr. Chairman. The second study by People for the American Way shows that you consistently sided against workers or immigrants and only once favored consumers in your dissents. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to have the People for the American Way study entered into the record.
Without objection.
A third study by Public Citizen shows that in cases where there was disagreement among the judges, you consistently sided against helping people who wanted to protect our clean air and water. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to have the Public Citizen study entered into the record as well.
Without objection.
A fourth study, a detailed study by Professors Cope and Fishman, found that you are, and I quote their study, no judicial moderate, and that, quote, it's hard to find a federal judge more conservative than Brett Kavanaugh. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to have the study of Professors Cope and Fishman entered into the record as well.
Without objection.
Judge Kavanaugh, why do you rarely dissent on behalf of consumers, workers, or the powerless? And please, don't talk to me about all the times that you were with the majority or where you joined other majorities.
Well, Senator, I've ruled for workers many times. I've ruled for environmental interests many times in big cases that involve clean air regulation, particulate matter regulation, affirmative defense for accidental emissions, the California Clean Air Law over a dissent by a fellow judge.
So, Judge Kavanaugh, I cited, how many studies did I enter into the record? At least 4 studies that indicate that there is a pattern to your dissents, and your pattern is that you do not favor basically regular people.
Well, I wrote one of my most important dissents, Senator, was in United States versus Burwell. That was a criminal case, an in-bank case for a convicted drug distributor. The question was whether he had been sentenced to a 30-year mandatory minimum permissibly, and I, joined by Judge Tatel, who's an appointee of President Clinton, ruled that the jury instructions were flawed. I was in dissent for him because mens rea requirement had been omitted from the jury instructions, and I wrote a very lengthy dissent about that. That is that's one of my most important dissents, and that was on behalf of a criminal defendant.
Judge Kavanaugh, the thing about patterns is that there are exceptions to the pattern. So all of these studies that I cite to, we're not talking about the exceptions to the pattern. We are talking about the existence of a pattern. You know, it bothers me I would expect a judge to follow the law. In fact, I think you started off several times saying that you are how did you describe yourself in terms of following the law? You said several times.
Independent and pro-law.
Pro-law.
Another important decision is a case, yes. I think I wrote the leading opinion, or one of the leading opinions on battered women's syndrome, a case called United States versus Noy, over a dissent of another judge where I reversed a conviction of a woman on the ground that she hadn't been
Judge
able.
Kavanaugh, I hate to continue to interrupt you, but 30 minutes goes by awfully fast, and there are always exceptions to the pattern. So yes, you describe yourself as a pro-law judge. Assumes that means that you consider yourself to be someone who follows precedent and the law. But over and over again, your colleagues and the majority criticize you for not following the law or Supreme Court precedent. Where Congress is clear, you miss the plain language. Where the Supreme Court clearly states rules, you ignore them. Let me cite you to some examples where your colleagues actually took the time to criticize your dissents. So in a 2008 case, Agri-Processor v. NLRB, the majority said the dissent, your dissent, creates its own rule. Instead of following Supreme Court rules, they said that your dissent abandons the text of the applicable laws altogether. Or in 2011, the majority in a case called Heller 2 held that Washington, D.C. could ban semi-automatic weapons, and the majority wrote an entire appendix to explain why your dissent was wrong and how you misread the Supreme Court. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to have the 10-page appendix in Heller 2 entered into the record.
Without objection.
In 2017, and U.S. v. Anthem, the majority sharply criticized your dissent. They said, quote, rather than engage with the record, much less adhere to our standard, the dissent offers a series of bald conclusions and mischaracterizes the court's opinion, end quote. They said that you, the dissenting colleague, applies the law as he wishes it were, not as it currently is. This doesn't sound like such a pro-law judge to me. Now, why do your colleagues go out of their way
Senator,
so often?
if you could begin to wrap up, please, ma'am.
Why do your colleagues go out of their way so often to point out that you aren't following the law or relevant Supreme Court cases?
Senator, I stand by my record. I've been in the majority, the vast majority of the time, 90 to 95% of the time. I've written opinions joined by colleagues of all stripes. I think there have been studies that shown the affiliation of the judges who joined me in majority opinions when there's been a dissent. I stand by my record. I am proud of my record. I have explained thoroughly my decisions in each case. I appreciate your perspective, and I understand the cases you've raised, but my opinions speak for themselves, and I'm very proud of them.
And I
Senator
think all
Crapo.
these studies speak for themselves also. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Crapo.
Thank you very